Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of the HDIAC podcast series. Today we will be discussing military anthropology with Dr. Robert Rubinstein. We'll pick up where we left off in part one.
So, Robert, thank you very much for that. I think that sets the stage for where we find ourselves today, and you already alluded to that. I think 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror certainly changed a number of things about the way the United States has traditionally waged war. Counterinsurgencies are, by their very nature, difficult and lengthy undertakings, and they are ones that require interaction with the local community by their very definition. So would you be willing to speak a little bit about military anthropology through the lens of these conflicts?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. You're bringing us into the 21st century, and I think all of the telegraphic history that I've just described comes together in our encounters with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So post 9/11, when the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, the anthropological community was predominantly, but not completely, because like any society, anthropologists are heterogeneous in their views. We share certain core beliefs and values, but we also differ among ourselves. But the vast majority of anthropologists objected to those expeditionary wars for a variety of reasons. The first is, as I've already alluded to, that some anthropologists saw those actions as expansions of American imperialism and empire. And by that, they simply mean that there's a kind of American exceptionalism where we will do things that we would not tolerate from other parties. We have military bases around the world on sovereign territory where our actions inevitably have the unintended or perhaps intended consequences that change the nature of the society. So there was an objection to the spread of what was called American empire. They felt as though there was a lack of understanding of the local cultures, that there was certainly a lack of understanding about how an invading force might be received. There was tremendous criticism of, for example, the claim by Donald Rumsfeld that we would be greeted as liberators in Iraq. And so there was a great critique. Now, to be even more telegraphic about the military history than I was about the anthropological history, it's probably fair to describe the initial actions as being wildly successful, as really seeming to deliver on the shock and awe that was promised. But after a little bit, not too long, the counterinsurgencies developed, the use of improvised explosive devices and so forth began to set back those initial successes. I'll say success in quotes, but they were military successes. The ways in which we dealt with the local societies were often seen by anthropologists as insensitive to local culture. For example, purging of all members of the Ba'athist Party in Iraq from government, the dissolution of the army there, seemed to be culturally insensitive to anthropologists who understood the dynamics of those societies and why people might be a member of a party even if they were not true believers in that party. But nonetheless, the setbacks led to a greater demand for cultural knowledge. The sort of simple way of saying this would be things started to go wrong, and the simple explanation wasn't that we didn't have the military power, so we must not understand the culture. And there was a call for anthropologists to help. But of course, as I've said, the range of what anthropologists do goes from what I'll call relatively benign, studying the organizations, military organizations, all the way through to those kind of working at the tip of the kinetic activities of militaries. And so the American Anthropological Association formed another commission with a long name. I can't reproduce it from memory. That was to look at the ethics, the professional responsibilities of anthropologists who would be working with the military and other elements of the national security state. And that was quite fraught. All of this became refracted by the development of the concept of the human terrain system, the human terrain teams, which was pioneered by an anthropologist, Dr. Montgomery McFate. And that became the flashpoint for anthropologists thinking about military anthropology. There was great objection to the notion of human terrain teams, which were to be consist of a number of people with specialties, including anthropologists with cultural specialties, that would advise units about actions in the area of operation. This advice was intended from Dr. McFate's perspective to be a positive contribution to cut down the number of civilians who were killed, I'll say mistakenly, and also to cut down the number of service members who were harmed as a result of miscommunication and so on. The vast majority of the American Anthropological Association, again, not everyone, argued that there was no way to ethically do anthropology, or even to do it effectively within the context of a human terrain team or system. The objections were that, first off, that really essential rapport that is going to need to be developed, the reciprocity that you're going to have in fieldwork, is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve when you arrive in a community backed up by military force and maybe yourself wearing a military uniform and perhaps carrying a weapon. There was objections as well to in that the idea of anthropological fieldwork is that we must have informed consent. And so how do you get informed consent? Referencing back to your earlier question, when you're coming from to the situation to interview people, again, backed up by the military. And finally, by implication, if you're advising about a community and you point out that the people on the right are good people, even if you don't say it, the implication is that people on the left are a threat. And so the dictum to do no harm and maybe even to do good for your communities would be very difficult to challenge or to carry out. So this became challenged within anthropology. A number of very distinguished anthropologists formed something they called the Network of Concerned Anthropologists that argued against the role of anthropologists or using anthropologists in counterinsurgency. And they went further. They argued that anthropology should not be used in the service of the national security state. Now, I will say from my own personal perspective that I am critical of the human terrain teams for the methodological and ethical challenges that were posed. But I do think that the network of concerned anthropologists mischaracterized military anthropology in a very significant way. From my perspective, if anthropology is at its core trying to understand people and societies who may do things very different than you would, and you might even abhor, but you're trying to understand them, then the military institutions, the security institutions of a country have to be part of the whole human experience that we study and work with. And I think that it was a mistake to think that our only clients, if you will, are disenfranchised, marginalized groups of people, though they are by far the largest number of groups that we've worked with. But we also have to do what an anthropologist named Lauren Nader argued we should do, which was to study up, to study elites, to study the powerful, and so on. And that necessarily means doing military and security anthropology.
Dr. Rubinstein, thank you so much for the discussion of the human terrain system, and that we were able to discuss the role of anthropologists in both Iraq and Afghanistan, both the benefit as well as some of the concerns that the community may have. My own personal experience in Iraq tells me that anthropologists and social scientists are a critical part of anyone seeking to defeat an insurgency, and they certainly can assist in supporting burgeoning democracies. Yet, as we've already discussed, the position of the American Anthropological Association opposing the human terrain system is well documented. But again, I recently read a 2015 article by Whitney Castle on foreign policy that was just simply titled, "The Army Needs Anthropologists." So as we've talked about this, I think that there certainly is some benefit, and I think you would agree that there is benefits to anthropologists being involved in these sort of operations. And I think maybe it's important to understand, based on your experience, that the military person needs to understand where you're coming from and what possibly your boundaries are. And likewise, I think that there's a role for the anthropologist to understand what the goals of the nation state might be. And I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the possible role and some of the things that you think the social scientists and anthropologists could do in this sort of conflict.
That's a really interesting question. It raise all sorts of issues. So I am of the age that I was socialized as an anthropologist in that post Vietnam War and post-Vietnam War ethos. And when I began studying peacekeeping operations, I found myself, not surprisingly, working with many military officers. And when I returned from the work I'd been doing in the Middle East, I found that I had developed reciprocal relationships with them, just like I had in my other fieldwork projects that were not particularly military. And so at one point, colleagues asked me if I would help them think about the role of culture in peacekeeping operations as they prepared a manual that would be useful for those who had to institute those operations. And at that point, I realized that indeed, what they were actually asking me was for my views on how the practice that they were involved might be made better, but also might change a little bit. And I recognized at that point that as a citizen, the responsibility was there to try and have these actions develop in ways that seemed consistent with my professional knowledge. That is to say, I had a responsibility to interact. I developed a view that you can't just stand on the outside critiquing something without really engaging in trying to understand the people you are dealing with. I've drawn from the anthropological literature sort of 8 principles that I think would be useful. And they're useful for anthropologists studying the military or working with the military, just as they are for the military thinking about how it might address local populations. And let me just say what these 8 principles are. Whatever it is that's being proposed to the local population should be consistent. You shouldn't be inconsistent and appear as though you're just being expeditious in what you're trying to convince them to do. Whatever you do, it should be based on a fairly thorough knowledge of the community that you're trying to interact with and affect. And in doing so, you have to take the whole community into account, not just one part which is good and ignore the part that you think might be bad. The goals of this, rather than saying this is calculated self-interest, should be phrased and should be understood by the local population in a way that has a positive value for them. You might think of that as the emotional component, if you will. You want the community to be an active partner in the change process, so you can't just decide that if they're not doing what you want them to do, that you're going to cut them out. You need to have a procedure for making sense for the community of how change will happen. You need to avoid becoming indispensable to the change. You want the community, when that change happens, to be self-sustaining. And you want to maintain really good communication between the people who are trying to make the change and the community. And I'll say this about the penultimate point that I just said. One of the things that I think is important for anthropologists to do is to take military institutions, military organizations, military communities seriously and to study them. And indeed, there are many anthropologists now who are doing that. They tend to be of a younger generation, but there is a great deal of constructive work that is now being done. But secondly, I want to say that if we don't want to make ourselves indispensable, we should never come to another time when our services are called upon because things have gone wrong and the capacity to understand culture no longer exists in the military. And one of the things that we've seen over the last century is that the call from militaries for cultural knowledge has been quite episodic and quite inconsistent. And so I think it's really important. The most fundamental thing that can be done to support counterinsurgency work would be for the institution as a whole, looking at the whole community, to take culture more seriously, to take social life more seriously. And the way it signals that is to value it among its members, so that people who choose to become foreign area experts, for example, have the same career opportunities that people who become expert in other areas of the military arts might, so that the whole military institution is suffused with an understanding of cultural dynamics in general and in specific places and at specific times. So I think there is a mutual conversation that can go on that can be quite instructive for our military's activities and can also be helpful in illuminating those parts of anthropology that take anthropology to be the study of all people and all of their practices that we do. So that would be the way I would respond to the question that you've just posed.
Okay. Well, Robert, I thank you very much. I think that concludes it all we wanted to discuss today. I'm grateful for your continued participation in these. Again, my personal experience shows the value of the dialogue between experts in different fields, and the coming together, the understanding, the shared objectives. I think the bottom line objectives are generally shared. And I think that through this open exchange of ideas, we can become better. So I'm very grateful for your time today.
Well, it's been a pleasure being with you, and thanks so much for an interesting conversation.
Thank you for joining the HDIAC podcast series. To learn more about our other services, please reach out directly or visit us online at www.hdIAC.org.